fundamentally are building cities that make us sick. This is such a stark image. This is Beijing in 2008, when the government shut down power plants and factories and asked people to stop driving for 12 days. And look at the impact visually on the environment. That's the effect of our choices. And we now know in 2016 that greenhouse gases emitted by transportation is the #1 cause of our pollution problem. The other thing that motivates me, and I think is a serious problem that people overlook, is this number of deaths on our roadways worldwide every single year. It's a health crisis. It's an epidemic. It's the #1 killer of young people worldwide and in the United States. And it's going up, not down, because we have cheap gas, free highways, and pretty inexpensive or free parking. Let's take a step back and look at history. Let's go way back, 5,000 years, Mari, Syria. Cities have been fundamentally the same since the beginning of time. They're built around transportation and trade and security, and fundamentally everything is within 5 to 15 minutes walk, or in this era, horse ride. What we know is that whether it's Mari, Syria, or today, the denser our infill development is, the more people we have per square yard, per square mile, there's a disproportionate increase in productivity. Well, we had 2 billion people on the planet in 1900. We're at 7 billion today, and we're on our way to 9 billion. But we can't keep consuming at the same rate. Now, skip ahead. Let's look at the turn of the last century. This is what cities look like. People ruled the streets in places like New York City. Or in Seattle, on First Avenue, people also ruled the streets, and congestion was not viewed as a bad thing. More congestion meant more business. How many people think these stores are doing well? Raise your hand. You don't need to be an economist or a sociologist to figure that out. Or right down the street in Washington, D.C., look at our balanced transportation system with people walking, biking, taking high-capacity streetcars. The pedestrian, though, fundamentally ruled. Now, skipping ahead to the 1950s, the Federal Aid Highway Act, or the National Interstate and Defense Act, as it came to be known post-war, was supposed to be a jobs program. It was supposed to facilitate interstate commerce, and it did. But we very quickly took it too far. This $25 billion infrastructure project started to tear the heart and the soul out of our cities. Instead of linking our cities, we drove highways right through our cities. We segregated people within our cities, and we changed the very fabric. And this is the dawn of suburbia. We pushed people out to the suburbs. The government policies, combined with the business models, created a land use problem as much as a transportation problem. And fundamentally, it also created a cultural problem where people became less tolerant, and I would argue less creative as a result. And industry sold us on this American dream, this great future with all these machines. And it looks beautiful except for the machines. And this was the birth of the American car culture. But what people don't think about is we started spending our money differently. A car was half of a year's income, and we started to buy more cars than houses. Houses are an appreciating asset, cars are a depreciating asset. And with every vehicle that was sold, there was a direct correlation to the fatalities that we saw on our roads. And not everybody benefited equally by this flight to the suburbs. Detroit is one of the starkest and greatest examples. During the 1920s, the black population swelled from 41,000 to 120,000 as people came from the South to work in the auto industry. And Black Bottom was a historic, predominantly African-American neighborhood. And when we drove the highway through, we killed 350 black-owned businesses. And we also destroyed the fabric of the community. And so, at the same time we were doing that, driving the highways through our cities, what else were we doing? We were shutting down all the streetcar systems, which is the way that people got around Detroit and other cities. And so we were abandoning people in their neighborhoods. And you can look almost to the month of the year, and you can see that we sent people a clear message: get the hell out of the city. And that's what people did. And white flight took place. Let's look at parking, because now we created an environment where You needed parking spaces. So in 1870, the US Congress told Washington, D.C., that you can take up to 50% of your space on your streets and devote it to park space. Not parking. Parking was park space back then. Now it means something else when people started to tie up their horses and then their cars between those trees. And we don't even know how many parking spaces we have now. We're talking about hundreds of millions. The best estimate I've seen is 500 million spaces. That's 2 for every automobile, and that's as much space for cars as there is for people. So, what's the effect of this? Let's say you want to rent an inexpensive $800 a month unit. Well, guess what? Because the developer had to build a parking space, because the city required it underground, guess what happens? That becomes a $1,300 apartment, even if you don't have a car. Oh, by the way, when you own the car, then it's another $900 a month. So it's a 62.5% increase. Meanwhile, we have more than 500,000 homeless people in the United States. And by the way, a quarter of these people are children, like this young girl behind me. So what's happening now in cities? What's happening is that we are getting denser, but particularly overseas. We sort of leveled off in the United States. This is Shanghai, and in 26 years, the time we would take to plan a metro system or maybe pass a bill for Zika virus here in the US, they've built a city with more than 24 million people, over 1,000 bus lines, a maglev train that gets to the airport in 8 minutes, or you can drive, but it's going to take you an hour, and 329 metro stations. And when I was over there in June and I was talking to the government officials, I said, with all this technology coming, autonomous cars, what are you planning? They said another 320 metro stations. People won't build a building there if you don't build a metro station for them. So there's increasing understanding that perhaps the transit that we build is not just about moving people. That's part of it. But it's really about creating the way of life that people want. The doctor's office and the stores and the bars and the restaurants and the schools around those nodes and the density. And so we're really moving from a post-war hyper-consumption mode, if you will, to a 21st century collaborative consumption mode. And I was lucky enough to work with Robin Chase at Zipcar in the early days. And it was the public-private partnerships that we built that facilitated the spreading of services like this. But it's not just about services and Airbnb and Uber and Lyft. It's also about the space that we have on the streets. This is Pennsylvania Avenue again. We used to have a very robust streetcar system. This was a transit, people-oriented street. Then it became a car-oriented street where the Secret Service basically parked. And we created a more balanced 8 to 80 complete street for an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old. And then we did supply the services to go with it in DC and Chicago. Bikeshare. Low cost, frictionless, leverages GPS technology, solar, modular design, and we make it very easy, no capital investment, less than 30 cents a day, you can ride a bike as much as you want. And now people in cities are realizing, wait a second, do I really need to go to the gym? Is that really necessary, or could I just walk or bike to work? Now, of course, it depends on your land use, right? Because we have built these places that are making us sick. And these places that are making us sick, we don't want to get out of our car. And so we drive there, we go up the escalator, down the escalator, we run on the treadmill, we come out, and we go home. And then we wonder, when we used to walk and bike everywhere, and now we drive everywhere, we wonder why a 15-year-old is now 15 pounds heavier than they were back then. We wonder why the average adult is 24 pounds heavier than they were in 1960. And looking at the fully loaded societal cost and benefit of the choices that we make, we now know that walking and biking infrastructure is essentially free. It throws off positive dividends to society because of the health and the sustainability effects. But we keep building roads for cars, even though cars are the most subsidized form of transportation. So in Chicago, we said, we're going to call out publicly that the pedestrian is our focus. That's our priority. It's the indicator species of a healthy city, a sustainable city, an economically viable city. And in New York, they've studied this, and they found that, guess what? When you create a place that people want to be, what do? They go there. And when they go there, they spend money. So this is a pro-business strategy. So my argument is perhaps we should be looking at the difference between spending and investing in our future. We've done a lot of stimulus road projects, but they aren't paying dividends. They're paying anti-dividends with negative ROI. And if we think we need more capacity, guess what? It's counterintuitive. We need less capacity. If you want people to drive less, take the road away. Take the lanes away, and guess what happens? They do something else. They ride their bike. They take the train. It's called induced demand. And when we are building infrastructure that's pro-people, as I learned building the Chicago Riverwalk, guess what? The private sector will foot the bill, particularly if they're going to benefit. They can have long-term leases. They can have more customers. They've learned the same thing in Dallas, where they decked over the freeway. And now it's the hottest neighborhood in the city with the highest real estate values. Or Seoul, Korea, where they went from this ugly double-decker freeway to a beautiful biophilic river. And now everybody wants to live there. Imagine that. Or in Barcelona, where they plan now to get rid of 2/3 of the traffic in their city. First, phase one, they're just going to get rid of it in terms of cut through. And then phase two, they're getting rid of it altogether. And so we have two types of streets, basically. We have our local streets, okay, and this is the street that you might live on, and the pedestrian should be the priority, period. And the car should always be the guest. And then we have our bigger arterial streets where we need to segregate traffic because we're going to have buses, we're going to have trucks, and people are only going to feel safe walking and biking and taking transit if they have their own space. Now, they've been doing this for decades in Northern Europe. If you've been to Amsterdam or anywhere in the Netherlands or Denmark, the car is the guest in most places. But for us, we have a very hard time in the US getting our heads around the concept of designing around people. And so I'm excited about technology, which might seem also counterintuitive. But I think that the only way we're going to make this cultural shift in the US back to designing around people is through technology, because it will give us the cover, if you will. It'll be the catalyst to make the change. And this technology is coming fast and furious. It's happening right now. And the beauty of the autonomous vehicle, by the way, is we can cut ownership rates in half in places that are not dense. Places like DC, 88% of people moving here aren't bringing a car or buying a car now without autonomous technology. So you can imagine it'll go to almost 100%. We can also cut those traffic fatalities, that 1.24 million worldwide, the 35,000 number in the US, imagine cutting it within 10 years by 90%. And, as important, we can reconfigure our cities on the street and off the street. Perkins and Will did this mock-up of what 40th Avenue in San Francisco could look like in the future. There's only one broken down Chevette left on this street. I was in Indianapolis recently, and I was so proud to see that they had taken a lane of traffic and they had built micro units, 300 square foot micro units, and they had bolted it onto what? A parking garage. So in this autonomous future, we can get rid of the parking garages because these vehicles are going to be electric, they're going to be shared, not owned, and they're going to be self-driven. So we can start using the right tool for the right problem. We don't have to use a car for everything. 60% of trips less than a mile in the United States are car-driven trips. That's a 10-minute walk. Now, when you look at what's happening in Northern Europe, they're moving to ban cars from their city centers by 2050 in the EU. Places like Oslo, in 2019, cars will be gone in the central core. So look, we're facing a lot of change. A lot of change. And I love this Kubler-Ross model because it's basically about death. But then it's about rebirth and the excitement that you get through the rebirth. And then once you experiment, then you can mainstream concepts. And that's what we're going to be doing. But I worry that we're not ready. I'm not sure that we're ready for this change, particularly in cities and in government. There's a lot of other change. We're going to be 3D printing iPhones down the street. And they're already 3D printing buildings in Denmark and in places like Dubai. There are new business models that are super exciting with very small format housing where you can buy it once and take it with you across the country, and they'll plug it into different units and slot it in just like a server into a rack. And then the biggest change is the coming era of unlimited and free energy, which most experts agree is going to happen. That's going to upend our entire economy and might actually save our lives. Now, big picture, I know what some of you are thinking. What is anybody going to do for work? So The Economist did a study on this with McKinsey, and the big thing that came out of it was, first of all, that STEM may be overrated because we might need creativity more than STEM when all the STEM jobs are automated. That's a little scary. But the other thing is they said in 15 years, jobs will dissolve. The way we work will be dissolved. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's going to happen or not going to happen, but I think when it comes to what we're talking about today about cities and how they work and how they operate, it's an important thing to think about. What if we're not working anymore or working 80 to 90% less? That means we're going to be spending a lot more time at home in our neighborhood, growing food in our neighborhood, hanging out in our neighborhood with our children. And what kind of city are we going to want to live in? And what kind of society are we going to want to be? So thinking back to the parking thing again, why are we building these spaces that we don't need? There's a hidden cost of parking. And if you look at one parking space, it's about the same size as a micro unit that can actually house 2 people. So what are we doing? Particularly when the return on investment is about 6 times on the micro unit, and we could give somebody a place to live for less than $400 a month. That's less than most subsidized rental housing is. So why aren't we doing that? We can take 0.05% of our current parking and put all those homeless people in a house. And I think the autonomous vehicles and some of the other technologies are going to help us get there. But we have to admit that we've totally screwed this one up. For the last 75 years, we've done things that are bad for people, bad for our planet, and definitely bad for business, particularly if you're not focused on quarter-to-quarter profits, which I'm not. And so the technology is a key part of the puzzle, but we can't get too wrapped up in the technology because think about what happened in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s with the combustion engine in the car. We thought that was the solution to everything, and we built everything around it, and look at the mess that we got ourselves in. So if we want 50% of trips to be active transportation trips, the other half to be shared mobility trips, which is ideal, whether it's transit or something else. We want more density near our transit stops. We want people to walk and bike. Then let's fit all this technology into the world that we want to create. Let's not build the technology and then hope that things work out for us. And maybe if we're able to achieve this lasting urban change, by the way, this is my daughter using the public space. I put her in there for that reason, for that effect. You know, I think we'll actually head back to a simpler time. We're going to go back to a simpler time, and I certainly hope so. And we're going to leverage the future to get back to that simpler time. Right now, we are the wealthiest country in the world, but guess what? We are 15th happiest. And you look at the countries that are happier, their urban planning is a bit different than ours. So this big directional shift starts with a very basic right to safe, high-quality public space. Also, to connectivity. We should not have to pay for connectivity to others. And then fundamentally, everybody should have a roof over their head as a basic human right. And by the way, it's good business. Thank you so much.